This is part 2 of topic 12, and we're still on international macroeconomics, and what we're looking at is the idea of money flowing in and out of the country and how that money is recorded in the balance of payments, how the inflows and outflows equal each other under a floating exchange rate system, and then we're going to finish off by looking at a small open economy model, which is quite insightful, as you will soon see. So what I've got here in this first slide is 4 variables: CO, CI, KFO, KFI. All 4 of these variables are measured in terms of billions of dollars. So CO is the sum of all of the individual transactions that are recorded in the current account that involve an outflow of money from Australia. So an example of that would be imports. Imports of either goods or services. So when we import a good or a service into Australia, money flows out of Australia. Imports are recorded in the current account, so they would be a current account outflow transaction. So within a year, all of the imported goods would be included in CO. Also, in the first income account, in the balance of payments in the current account, that first income account records dividend payments and interest payments. So every time an Australian company pays interest to a foreign lender or pays a dividend to a foreign owner of an Australian share, money flows out of Australia, it's recorded in the current account. So it's a CO type transaction. So CO is going to include all of the money flowing out due to imports, as well as dividend payments and interest payments, as well as other smaller transactions. Similarly, CI represents inflows, so it's exports of Australian goods, and money flows into Australia as a result of our exports. Also, dividend and interest payments flowing from overseas into Australia would be included in CI as well. Just a reminder, CO, CI, they are some dollar value measured in terms of billions. KFO is a capital financial account outflow, so mainly we're talking about investment flows here. So KFO is domestic foreign investment, so investment money flowing overseas from Australia, and inflow, KFI, is foreign investment money coming into Australia. Now, what we've seen from the balance of payments is that inflows and outflows generally equal each other. So what I've got here is that the outflows, the sum of the outflow transactions, which are measured in billions of dollars, must equal the sum of all of the inflow transactions. Now, the important thing to understand here is that outflow transactions create a supply of the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange market. So an outflow transaction would be you buying a Japanese car. When you do that, the car comes into Australia, but if you pay, say, $40,000 for that car, the money flows out. Now, as that money flows out in payment for the car to Japan, then it will pass through the foreign exchange market. You will literally hand over your $40,000. That money then needs to move through the foreign exchange market, get swapped for yen, and then the equivalent amount of yen goes back to the manufacturer of the car. Now, when you pay that 40,000 Australian dollars and it moves into the foreign exchange market and gets swapped for yen, at that point you are supplying $40,000 worth of foreign exchange to the foreign exchange market. So every time money flows out of Australia, it creates a supply of the Australian dollar. Another example would be you purchasing a Microsoft share on the New York Stock Exchange. You would hand over the money for the purchase of that share. The money would move, your Australian dollars would move through the foreign exchange market, and an additional supply of Australian dollars would be created by that transaction as that money moves to whatever country of origin the seller of the Microsoft share was in. With inflows, that creates a demand for the Australian dollar. Let me give you an example of that. Let's think about foreign money coming into Australia, an inflow, as a result of foreigners wanting to invest in Australia. Let's just imagine that that foreigner wants to invest in Australia by buying Australian shares. Well, a foreigner can't use yen or US dollars or euros to buy a share on the Australian stock market. They need Australian dollars. So when they buy an Australian share, they first need to demand Australian dollars, so to purchase Australian dollars, and then take those Australian dollars to purchase the share. So as money is coming into Australia, investment money in this example, it creates a demand for the Australian dollar, because you can't use yen to invest in Australia. You need Australian dollars. So foreigners must buy Australian dollars first, then use those Australian dollars to buy Australian shares or Australian equity. So it creates an inflow of Australian dollars. Now I know that sometimes Australian companies will actually borrow money, borrow US dollars or borrow yen. First of all, that doesn't make any difference to the result that we are slowly heading towards. And second of all, those transactions tend to be quite small relative to borrowing denominated in Australian dollars. So moving forward, what I've got in this slide is just a reminder that inflows and outflows must equal each other. So while in Australia we have a capital financial account surplus, a KFAS, we've got a current account deficit. So the money comes in through the capital financial account surplus and leaves through the current account deficit. So then the question that I've got in the second last line here is, what ensures that inflows equal outflows of money in the Australian context? The answer is the exchange rate. So if we have a look here, I've got a little bit of algebra here on the side. You can have a look at that if you want, but it just shows that when inflows and outflows equal each other, you can manipulate that to get the equation down the bottom, which says that the current account balance equals the capital financial account balance. It's just that they are of opposite sign. At the top here, I'm simply saying that demand is created by inflow transactions, supply by outflow transactions. Now let's have a look at this demand and supply curve for the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange market. Let's just imagine on any particular day, $12 is demanded and supplied, i.e. traded in the foreign exchange market. Now, if the exchange rate is perfectly flexible like it is in the Australian case, then the exchange rate will move to this equilibrium point where demand equals supply very, very quickly, and we will have equilibrium where demand is 12 and supply is 12. First question, who would be demanding Australian dollars? The answer is people that don't have Australian dollars. So typically this demand is being generated by foreigners because they want to buy something Australian. Now, when a foreigner demands Australian dollars, they could be buying an Australian good, a service, a bond, a share. So it could be a good, a service, or some sort of financial asset. From this diagram, though, we know that if $12 is being demanded by a foreigner in the foreign exchange market, then they have the intention of actually sending $12 into Australia. Second question, who creates the supply of Australian dollars? Well, it must be people that have Australian dollars. So typically it's Australians. I know there's exceptions to what I'm saying here, but I'm just trying to keep it nice and simple so that we get the idea and we can move on to more advanced understanding of this a little bit later on. So who supplies Australian dollars? Typically it is Australians, and Australians will supply the Australian dollar when they seek to purchase a foreign good, service or asset. So when you buy that Japanese car for $40,000, you're actually supplying the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange market. So because the supply is being driven by Australians wanting to buy something foreign, then the supply curve tells us that $12 is actually flowing out of the country. So demand by foreigners, they're sending $12 in. Supply by Australians, they're sending $12 out. So if the exchange rate is free to move to this equilibrium, the exchange rate will move to a point where the amount of money flowing into Australia equals the amount of money flowing out. If, for example, the exchange rate was below equilibrium, it was just sort of magically held at a level below equilibrium, then we would have demand being greater than supply. That would mean the amount of money flowing into Australia is greater than the amount of money flowing out, and that would create problems in the sense that we would have a net inflow of money, and if that occurred year after year after year, it would eventually be quite inflationary. So that explains how the balance of payments balances. It's really the exchange rate moving to the level to create demand and supply equilibrium in the foreign exchange market. In the next slide, we are dealing with the open economy model. Now, there's a little bit of information there that I will let you read through in your own time, but I'll go through and explain what this model is all about. First of all, on the vertical axis, we've got the real exchange rate. On the horizontal, we've got the quantity of Australian dollars exchanged in the foreign exchange market. We've got two curves. The first one, S minus I, is savings minus investment. And I've got a figure there of $10. So let's just imagine in a particular time period, it could be a month, it could be a year, it could be a week. The time period doesn't matter. So we're just developing a conceptual understanding of this model at this stage. So in this particular period, savings exceeded investment by $10. Now, if we're saving more than we are investing, we can not only pay for all of our own investment using our domestic savings, but we've got $10 worth of savings left over. Now, the question then is, well, what is going to happen to this $10 of excess savings? Well, that money has got to earn a return somewhere. It's got to be put to work, that extra $10 of savings. Because we've already financed all of our own domestic investment, then that money can't be used to purchase or finance investment through purchasing shares or bonds. So there's no place for this money to go to work in the Australian economy. So this $10 will flow overseas. So in that sense, it will create a supply of the Australian dollar equal to $10. So this vertical line is, in a sense, a supply curve of the Australian dollar. Now, that is only true if this number is positive. If it's negative, it's actually a demand for the Australian dollar. But let's not worry about that at the moment. So let's not complicate it in this way. Let's just consider this savings minus investment line as always being positive, just for now. Why is this line vertical? Well, savings, the level of savings that we undertake in Australia is independent of the real exchange rate. So does the amount of money you save depend upon the real exchange rate? Probably not. The level of investment spending, I'm also assuming that that is independent of the real exchange rate as well. Does the level of investment spending in Australia depend upon the real exchange rate today? Does the level of investment spending today depend upon the real exchange rate today? No, there's no sensible reason to think that that is the case. So both savings and investment are independent of the real exchange rate. The line is vertical. Net exports, the green line, is downward sloping, and exports create a demand for the Australian dollar. As we export, foreigners demand the Australian dollar to pay for those exports. Now, this is net exports, so it's actually exports minus imports. So in a sense, this is a net demand curve because exports create a demand, but NX is equal to X minus M, exports minus imports. So the exports create a demand for the Australian dollar, but imports create a supply of the Australian dollar. So this, in a sense, is a net demand curve. So X minus M, demand minus supply, it's a net demand curve associated with imports and exports. But let's just think of it as a demand curve. So what we've got here is a supply curve vertical and demand curve downward sloping. And because it's a demand and supply curve for the Australian dollar, the exchange rate moves quickly to equilibrium to make sure that S minus I equals NX. That's the important point. At this point where these lines intersect, S minus I equals NX. And that equation, S minus I equals NX, is going to be incredibly important later on in this topic, and it really does, it will really help us understand what's going on in the macroeconomy when things like savings changes, investment changes, or imports or exports change. Okay, so let's use this particular model. We start off at the initial equilibrium, S1 minus I equals NX. And then what happens is savings, the level of savings in Australia increases from S1 to S2. Now, as savings goes up, that shifts the line to the right. So we're actually, judging by the numbers on the horizontal axis here, we're increasing savings by $5. More savings and the same amount of investment shifts this line to the right. Now, as we save more, that actually increases the supply of Australian dollars in the foreign exchange market. So the supply of Aussie dollars in the foreign exchange market goes from 10 to 15. As we have a greater amount of money passing through the foreign exchange market, that pushes the exchange rate down. More supply of the Aussie dollar, the value of the Aussie dollar goes down, the exchange rate goes down, and that moves us along the NX curve. So the level of net exports increases too. The level of net exports increases from 10 to 15, just like S minus I increased from 10 to 15. So in a country, if a country is able to save more, it will, in terms of the open economy part of the economy, it will drive the exchange rate down, and it will increase the level of net exports. So when the exchange rate drops, what will be happening here as we move along the green line to the new equilibrium is exports will increase as a result of the depreciation, and imports will actually go down. So exports go up, imports go down until we move this new equilibrium. So you can actually develop quite a good understanding of what is going on